The United States Department of Justice released over 3 million pages of documents related to its investigation of Jeffrey Epstein in January 2026, representing the largest disclosure to date in one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern American history. Among the most explosive revelations contained in these files are thousands of text messages and extensive communications between Steve Bannon, former White House chief strategist and influential conservative voice, and Jeffrey Epstein during the period from 2018 to 2019. These communications occurred years after Epstein's initial conviction for sex offenses and continued right up until his arrest on federal sex trafficking charges in July 2019. The documents reveal a relationship far more extensive and intimate than Bannon had previously acknowledged, raising serious questions about judgment, accountability, and the nature of Epstein's connections to powerful political figures. The text messages between Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein, now part of the public record through the Department of Justice release, reveal regular communication between the two men over an 18-month period. According to documents reviewed by multiple news organizations, including NBC News, CNN, and the New York Times, Bannon and Epstein communicated frequently about media strategy, geopolitical matters, and political maneuvering. In June 2019, just weeks before Epstein's final arrest, Bannon sent a text message reading, "Dude," expressing enthusiasm about information Epstein had shared. The casual, familiar tone of their communications suggests a level of comfort and friendship that extended well beyond any professional or documentary filmmaker relationship that Bannon has subsequently claimed. The communications covered a wide range of topics. They discussed strategies to, in Bannon's words, take down Pope Francis. In one text message, Bannon wrote, "We'll take down Francis," grouping the pontiff alongside the Clintons, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and the European Union as targets of their efforts. Epstein, according to the messages, supported and encouraged these plans. The two men also discussed international political connections. From Paris, Epstein pressed Bannon to rally United States support behind a Slovakian leader seeking a top NATO post. Bannon, meanwhile, sought Epstein's assistance in connecting an Israeli ally with that country's former prime minister. In one particularly revealing exchange, Bannon asked Epstein, "Do you know anyone in Europe that wants to control the European Parliament and with it the EU?" The files indicate that Bannon was attempting to build a global populist movement and sought Epstein's help in making international connections. Text messages show Bannon discussing and scheming about building transnational alliances, with Epstein serving as a facilitator and advisor. The documents reveal Epstein had connections to far-right political figures across Europe, including Marine Le Pen in France and Matteo Salvini in Italy. Beyond the communications themselves, the released documents reveal financial arrangements between Bannon and Epstein that further complicate Bannon's claims that their relationship was purely professional and focused on documentary filmmaking. Emails from November and December 2018 indicate that both Steve Bannon and his son Sean Bannon received Hermes Apple watches valued at $1,490 each from Epstein. The watches were identical models described in the emails as 44 mm, space gray, stainless steel case, space black. An email from Epstein's assistant Leslie Groff noted, "Jeffrey will give to Steve when he sees him next." In March 2019, Bannon texted Epstein from Rome asking, "Is it possible to get your plane here to collect me?" This reference to using Epstein's private aircraft, the same plane that has figured prominently in allegations about Epstein's sex trafficking operation, demonstrates the depth of access Bannon had to Epstein's resources. Epstein replied that the plane was unavailable, but offered to cover the cost of a charter flight for Bannon instead. In another exchange, Bannon wrote, "I'm staying with you tonight?" Epstein confirmed, "Yes, stay." These communications indicate that Bannon stayed at Epstein's residences, accepted expensive gifts, and sought access to Epstein's private plane, all while maintaining that his interest in Epstein was solely as a documentary subject. Perhaps the most politically explosive revelation in the text messages is a New Year's Eve 2018 exchange in which Bannon discussed President Donald Trump's fitness for office with Jeffrey Epstein. On December 31st, 2018, Bannon wrote to Epstein, "I think it's beyond borderline 25th Amendment." The reference was to the constitutional provision allowing for the removal of a president deemed unable to discharge the duties of the office. This represents a stunning statement from someone who had been one of Trump's closest advisors and who publicly positioned himself as a loyal Trump supporter and champion of Trump-aligned political movements. Epstein replied, "He is really borderline, not sure what he may do." The fact that Bannon was privately discussing the potential removal of President Trump with Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender, while publicly championing Trump's agenda, has created considerable controversy and damaged Bannon's credibility with some elements of the conservative movement. The context of this exchange remains unclear from the released documents. What specific presidential behavior or decision prompted Bannon to raise the 25th Amendment with Epstein is not evident from the texts. However, the mere fact that such a discussion occurred reveals a level of trust and intimacy in their relationship that contradicts Bannon's subsequent characterizations of Epstein as merely a documentary subject. In April 2019, just months before Epstein's final arrest and during a period when renewed scrutiny of Epstein was mounting in the media, Bannon texted Epstein with an offer that has become central to the controversy. Bannon wrote, "First, we need to push back on the lies, then crush the pedo trafficking narrative, then rebuild your image as philanthropist." This message reveals that Bannon was actively working to rehabilitate Epstein's public image. The specific reference to crushing the pedo trafficking narrative is particularly damaging, as it suggests Bannon was attempting to help Epstein combat truthful allegations about his crimes rather than investigating them as a documentarian would. In another message from this period, Bannon acknowledged the impossibility of Epstein's rehabilitation, writing, "We must count a rapist who traffics in female children to be raped by world's most powerful, richest men. That can't be redeemed." Despite this acknowledgement that Epstein's crimes were beyond redemption, Bannon continued working with him and maintaining their relationship. Bannon arranged what he described as media training sessions in April 2019, writing, "Friday afternoon media training, A in your place, and 2 camera shoot, my crew so totally confidential." Epstein responded that the session would be trial by fire. These communications indicate that Bannon brought a camera crew to Epstein's residence to coach him on handling media scrutiny. The Department of Justice has released nearly 2 hours of video from interviews Bannon conducted with Epstein, believed to be part of this documentary project. According to reports, Bannon has an additional 15 hours of audio recordings from his conversations with Epstein that have not been publicly released. In the released video footage, Bannon's approach to interviewing Epstein is notably gentle and sympathetic. He asks Epstein about his time in jail following his 2008 conviction, but the questions focus on Epstein's personal experience rather than his crimes or victims. Bannon asks whether Epstein had reflected on how he ended up in that situation. Epstein's responses reveal a striking lack of self-awareness or remorse. When Bannon asked if he had ever had a moment of awareness of, "How could I get myself into this situation?" Epstein replied, "No, I would just say how strange that this happens. Just, it's strange. I'm wearing a jumpsuit and flip-flops." This response, characterizing his incarceration for sex offenses against a minor as merely strange, encapsulates Epstein's apparent inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the gravity of his crimes. In response to the release of these documents, Steve Bannon has defended his communications with Epstein as part of legitimate documentary filmmaking. In a statement to the New York Times, he said, "I am a filmmaker and TV host with decades of experience interviewing controversial figures. That's the only lens through which these private communications should be viewed. A documentary filmmaker working over a period of time to secure 50 hours of interviews from a reclusive subject." Bannon has indicated that he plans to release a documentary later in 2026 that will include the extensive interviews he conducted with Epstein. He claims this documentary will destroy the myths surrounding Epstein and expose truths about his criminal enterprise and connections to powerful individuals. However, this explanation has been met with widespread skepticism for several reasons. First, the intimate and friendly tone of many communications goes well beyond what would typically characterize a documentarian's relationship with a subject, particularly a subject guilty of serious crimes. Second, the explicit messages about helping to rebuild Epstein's image and crush the pedo trafficking narrative suggest active participation in reputation management rather than objective documentary investigation. Third, the acceptance of expensive gifts, requests to use Epstein's private plane, and stays at Epstein's residences all point to a personal relationship that extended beyond professional documentary work. Fourth, the gentle, even sympathetic approach visible in the released interview footage contrasts sharply with the hardball questioning one would expect from someone genuinely investigating serious criminal activity. The revelation of Bannon's extensive relationship with Epstein has created significant fractures within conservative political movements and damaged his standing among previous supporters. The fallout has been both swift and severe. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn wrote on social media that if Bannon and Epstein were behind it, Bannon needs to be brought in for questioning. This statement from Flynn, who had previously been closely aligned with Bannon politically, represents a significant breach. Former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, a prominent voice in the MAGA movement, stated there was no excuse for having such a friendly relationship with Epstein post-conviction 2018-19. None. Her unequivocal condemnation demonstrates how toxic association with Epstein has become, even for controversial figures on the political right. Political strategist Roger Stone, another figure with long ties to Trump and conservative politics, has also distanced himself from Bannon over the Epstein revelations. The fact that these individuals, all previously aligned with Bannon's political goals and worldview, have publicly criticized him, demonstrates the severity of the damage to his reputation. The backlash has extended beyond the United States. According to reports in The Guardian, lawmakers in France and Italy are questioning far-right nationalist figures about potential ties to Bannon or Epstein. The revelations have created international complications for populist movements that Bannon had been working to support and coordinate. It is important to note that Bannon has not been accused of or charged with any criminal wrongdoing in connection with Epstein's crimes. No evidence has emerged suggesting Bannon had knowledge of or participated in Epstein's sex trafficking operation. However, the documented relationship, occurring years after Epstein's conviction and during the period when new allegations were emerging, raises serious questions about Bannon's judgment and his willingness to associate with and assist a convicted sex offender. The Epstein file releases and ongoing investigations have also focused intense scrutiny on billionaire Leslie Wexner, the 88-year-old former chief executive of Victoria's Secret parent company, L Brands. Wexner has long been identified as Epstein's primary financial benefactor and the source of much of the wealth that enabled Epstein's criminal enterprise. On February 18, 2026, Wexner gave a 6-hour deposition to the House Oversight Committee from his home in New Albany, Ohio. The testimony represents Wexner's most extensive public accounting of his relationship with Epstein to date. In his prepared opening statement, Wexner sought to position himself as a victim of Epstein's schemes. "I was naive, foolish, and gullible to put any trust in Jeffrey Epstein," he testified. "He was a con man, and while I was conned, I have done nothing wrong and have nothing to hide." According to Wexner's account, he met Epstein in the 1980s through insurance executive Bob Meister and subsequently hired him as a financial manager. Wexner claims he granted Epstein power of attorney over his finances and later discovered that Epstein had misappropriated tens of millions of dollars from his accounts and investments. Wexner testified that he completely and irrevocably cut ties with Epstein nearly 20 years ago after learning he was an abuser, a crook, and a liar. This timeline would place the end of their relationship around 2006 or 2007, shortly before Epstein's first conviction in 2008. Democratic members of the House Oversight Committee expressed strong skepticism about virtually every aspect of Wexner's testimony. Representative Robert Garcia of California, the committee's ranking Democrat, provided extensive comments to reporters during breaks in the deposition. "We know that Wexner was Jeffrey Epstein's single largest benefactor," Garcia stated. "Much of that came directly from Wexner, and it's not clear why." He emphasized that the relationship between the two men extended over many years and involved transfers of enormous sums of money that enabled Epstein to purchase his private island, private plane, Manhattan townhouse, and other assets used in his criminal enterprise. There would be no Epstein Island, there'd be no Epstein plane, there would be no money to traffic women and girls. Mr. Epstein would not be the wealthy man he was without the support of Les Wexner, Garcia said. This statement encapsulates the Democratic position that Wexner bears responsibility for providing the financial resources that made Epstein's crimes possible, regardless of whether Wexner had direct knowledge of those crimes. Representative Dave Min of California went further, calling Wexner's claim that he had no knowledge of Epstein's abuse just not credible. Min noted that Wexner and Epstein spent extensive time together over many years, making it difficult to believe that Wexner remained entirely unaware of Epstein's behavior and preferences. The House Oversight Committee panel has indicated that Wexner gave Epstein about $1 billion through various stock transfers and cash payments over the course of their relationship. If this figure is accurate, and the committee appears to have documentary evidence to support it, this would represent the single largest source of Epstein's wealth and the financial foundation for his entire operation. In his testimony, Wexner maintained that he did not consider Epstein a close friend and that their relationship was purely business-related. He testified that he never witnessed any of Epstein's criminal activity and had no knowledge of the sex trafficking operation. This characterization directly contradicts accounts from other sources and evidence in the Epstein files. The documents reveal extensive social interactions between Wexner and Epstein, travel together, and Epstein's integration into Wexner's business and social circles to a degree that goes well beyond a typical client-advisor relationship. Wexner acknowledged that he visited Epstein's private island in the Caribbean, but claimed this was only for a few hours with his family and that he saw no indication of criminal activity during that brief visit. He maintained that Epstein systematically deceived him about the nature of his activities and the source of his connections to powerful individuals. The credibility of this account has been challenged by multiple lawmakers. Representative Garcia characterized Wexner's testimony as an attempt to downplay the closeness of his relationship with Epstein. Several committee members noted that Wexner's name appears more than 4,000 times in the released Epstein files, suggesting a relationship far more extensive and intimate than Wexner's testimony acknowledged. One of the most striking revelations from Wexner's testimony concerns the apparent lack of any federal investigation into his role. Wexner testified that he has never been questioned by the FBI or Department of Justice about his relationship with Epstein, despite being identified as Epstein's primary financial benefactor and despite his name appearing thousands of times in the files. Representative Garcia characterized this as outrageous, noting that Wexner has been named by survivors of Epstein's abuse and is clearly documented as the source of much of Epstein's wealth, yet has apparently faced no federal scrutiny. This raises serious questions about whether the Justice Department has adequately investigated all of those who enabled Epstein's crimes. The FBI did identify Wexner as a possible co-conspirator in an internal August 2019 document compiled days after Epstein's death in custody. However, Wexner has not been charged with any crime. A legal representative stated that a federal prosecutor told Wexner's counsel that he was being viewed as a source of information about Epstein and was not a target in any respect. This characterization, that the person who allegedly provided approximately $1 billion to a sex trafficker is merely a source of information rather than a target of investigation, has troubled lawmakers and survivors' advocates who argue it demonstrates a pattern of protecting wealthy and powerful individuals connected to Epstein. The release of over 3 million pages of Epstein documents represents one of the largest such disclosures in Justice Department history. In addition to the documents, the release includes more than 2,000 videos and approximately 180,000 images collected during the investigation. Yet many observers, including survivors of Epstein's abuse and members of Congress from both political parties, argue that the releases have created more confusion than clarity. The manner of disclosure, including lists of politically exposed persons that contain obviously irrelevant names like Elvis Presley alongside actual Epstein associates, has been criticized as an attempt to muddy the waters rather than provide transparency. Multiple members of Congress have complained about their inability to access truly unredacted versions of documents despite promises of full disclosure. The continued heavy redactions, combined with what appears to be selective decisions about which names to protect and which to expose, has fueled criticism that the Justice Department is protecting certain powerful individuals while failing to provide the accountability that both survivors and the public deserve. The Epstein case represents a profound failure of the American justice system. A serial sex offender with connections spanning presidents, princes, and billionaires operated for decades. He received an unconscionably lenient plea deal in 2008 from then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta that effectively shielded him and potential co-conspirators from federal prosecution. He died in federal custody in August 2019 under circumstances that remain controversial before facing full accountability for his crimes. The document releases were intended to provide the transparency necessary for public understanding and accountability. Instead, the process has been marked by selective redactions, inclusion of irrelevant names alongside relevant ones, and what many view as deliberate obstruction of congressional oversight. As investigations continue and additional documents are released, pressure is mounting on the Justice Department to provide complete transparency and on prosecutors to pursue all individuals who enabled or participated in Epstein's crimes. Whether that accountability will ultimately be delivered remains an open and deeply consequential question.